In the summer of 1941, inside a quiet office in Tokyo, the fate of an empire was being reduced to arithmetic. Japan had roughly 50 million barrels of oil in reserve. On paper, that sounded immense. In reality, it was a countdown clock. The Imperial Japanese Navy, one of the most powerful fleets on Earth, consumed enormous quantities of fuel simply to train, patrol, and remain combat ready. Once the United States froze Japanese assets and imposed the oil embargo in July 1941, that clock started ticking in earnest. Without new imports, Japan's military planners estimated their reserves would last roughly 18 months under wartime conditions. Some internal projections were even more pessimistic. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood the math. Educated in the United States, familiar with American industrial capacity, he knew Japan could not win a prolonged war. He reportedly warned that he could run wild for 6 months to a year, but beyond that he had no confidence. His concern was not courage or tactics, it was production. In 1940, the United States produced over 180 million barrels of oil annually. Japan produced almost none domestically. Every ship sortie, every pilot training flight, every fleet exercise consumed fuel that could not be replaced. Yet the Naval General Staff made a critical assumption. The war would be short. The plan was simple in concept and breathtaking in risk. Cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, seize the oil-rich territories of Southeast Asia, fortify a defensive perimeter, and force Washington to negotiate before American industry could fully mobilize. It was a gamble that depended not on firepower, but on time. In the months before December 1941, a Japanese naval intelligence officer named Takeo Yoshikawa conducted detailed surveillance of Pearl Harbor. Disguised as a diplomat, he observed ship movements, harbor depth, and defensive patterns. At one point, he even swam in Hawaiian waters using a hollow reed as a breathing tube to avoid detection. His reports were meticulous. He identified battleships, carriers, anchorage positions, and something else of immense strategic value. Massive above-ground fuel storage tanks containing approximately 4.5 million barrels of oil. Those fuel tanks were the logistical heart of the Pacific Fleet. Destroy them, and American naval operations from Hawaii would be paralyzed for months. Yet when the Japanese carrier aircraft struck on December 7, 1941, they targeted battleships, airfields, and aircraft. The fuel storage facilities were left untouched. Whether due to operational caution, fear of American counterattack, or simple prioritization of capital ships, the result was the same. The United States retained the fuel infrastructure necessary to sustain long-term operations in the Pacific. That decision would echo for years. At the time, the attack on Pearl Harbor appeared tactically brilliant. 8 battleships damaged or sunk, aircraft destroyed on the ground, the Pacific Fleet reeling. Across Asia, Japanese forces advanced with stunning speed. Hong Kong fell, Malaya collapsed, the Philippines were invaded. In early 1942, Japanese troops swept into the Dutch East Indies, capturing some of the richest oil fields in the world. On the surface, it looked like the gamble had paid off. But oil is not merely extracted. It must be refined, transported, protected, and distributed across thousands of miles of ocean. The Japanese had planned for seizure. They had not fully accounted for restoration. Retreating Dutch engineers sabotaged wells and refineries, setting facilities ablaze and destroying critical components. Repair required time, technical expertise, and spare parts Japan did not readily possess. Even when production resumed, the oil had to be shipped north through waters increasingly patrolled by American submarines. Meanwhile, consumption never stopped. Carrier task forces required vast quantities of fuel oil. Battleships burned thousands of tons simply getting underway. Pilot training programs, essential for maintaining an effective air arm, consumed aviation gasoline daily. Every month of war drained reserves faster than optimistic projections had suggested. The initial stockpile of 50 million barrels began to shrink. The fundamental miscalculation was not that Japan lacked bravery or operational skill. It was that planners treated oil as a static number rather than a dynamic system. They assumed captured fields would seamlessly replace embargoed imports. They underestimated American submarine effectiveness. They overestimated their own ability to protect shipping lanes across a Pacific that spanned more than 60 million square miles. By mid-1942, the strategic picture was already shifting. The Battle of Midway cost Japan 4 fleet carriers, irreplaceable assets built over years. Replacing ships required steel and labor. Replacing trained pilots required fuel. And replacing lost oil tankers required shipyards that were already strained. The arithmetic grew harsher with each passing month. Yamamoto's 6-month window of confidence expired almost precisely on schedule. American shipyards began launching new carriers at astonishing speed. American oil production continued virtually untouched by the war. Tankers crossed the Atlantic and Pacific in protected convoys. The United States was fighting a global war while supplying not only its own forces, but also its allies. Japan, by contrast, was fighting on borrowed fuel. The tragedy is that many within the Japanese high command understood the risk. Internal memoranda acknowledged that without access to stable oil supplies, the empire could not sustain a multi-year conflict. But strategic momentum, national pride, and fear of economic strangulation pushed the decision forward. Once the embargo tightened, leaders believed inaction meant decline. War, however dangerous, seemed preferable to slow strategic suffocation. And so the attack went forward. The carriers sailed, the bombs fell, the world changed in a single morning. But beneath the explosions and headlines, beneath the smoke rising over Battleship Row, the true battle had already begun. A silent contest of production charts, shipping tonnage, refinery output, and fuel consumption curves. It was a war measured not only in ships sunk or territory seized, but in barrels burned per day. In December 1941, Japan possessed one of the most formidable naval strike forces ever assembled. By simple calculation, it also possessed a finite reservoir of energy with no guaranteed replacement. The empire had wagered everything on a rapid collapse of American will. Instead, it awakened an industrial giant whose oil fields lay safely beyond the reach of Japanese bombers. The miscalculation was not dramatic. It did not explode or sink in flames. It was quiet, numerical, almost invisible. A subtraction problem repeated month after month. And once the numbers began moving in the wrong direction, there was no strategy bold enough to reverse them. The war in the Pacific would be fought with torpedoes, bombs, and courage, but its outcome, from the very beginning, was governed by arithmetic.
By early 1942, it appeared that Japan's gamble had worked. In just a few months, imperial forces had overrun a vast arc of territory stretching from Malaya to the Philippines and deep into the Dutch East Indies. These were not symbolic victories, they were strategic objectives. Beneath the jungles and swamps of Borneo and Sumatra lay some of the richest oil fields in the world. For Japanese planners, this was the solution to the arithmetic crisis that had haunted them in 1941. The Dutch East Indies had been producing tens of millions of barrels of oil annually before the war. Fields at Balikpapan in Borneo and refineries at Palembang in Sumatra were critical nodes in the global petroleum network. If Japan could capture them intact, restore production quickly, and ship the oil safely back to the home islands, the fuel clock might be reset.
But oil infrastructure is fragile. As Japanese forces advanced, Dutch engineers implemented a scorched earth strategy. Wells were sabotaged, pipelines were blown apart with dynamite, refineries were set ablaze, storage tanks were destroyed or contaminated. At Balikpapan, retreating personnel systematically dismantled equipment and ignited facilities to deny their use. At Palembang, demolition teams reduced key refining units to twisted steel. The destruction was deliberate and thorough. When Japanese troops arrived, they found oil fields that existed on maps but not in functional reality. Repairing them was far more complex than seizing them. Modern oil production required specialized drilling equipment, precision refinery components, replacement parts, and trained technicians. Japan lacked both the industrial base and the experienced petroleum engineers necessary to rapidly restore large-scale output. Spare parts had to be manufactured at home and shipped thousands of miles. Skilled workers were in short supply. Even under ideal conditions, recovery would take months. Meanwhile, the war did not pause. Every fleet maneuver consumed fuel. Carrier aviation required constant training to maintain combat effectiveness. Pilots needed flight hours. Ships required patrols. Convoys had to be escorted. Consumption continued at a wartime pace, even as replacement supplies remained uncertain. The reserves captured in Southeast Asia were potential energy, not usable energy, until they could be refined and transported. Transport itself became the next bottleneck. Oil had to travel from the Dutch East Indies through narrow sea lanes, across submarine-infested waters, to refineries and depots in Japan. Tankers were suddenly among the most valuable assets in the empire. Yet Japan had never built enough of them. Before the war, the nation relied heavily on foreign shipping and commercial networks that were now cut off. The available tanker fleet was limited, and building new ones required steel and shipyard capacity already committed to warships. At first, the scale of the problem was not obvious. Production in some captured fields did resume gradually. Japanese engineers worked under intense pressure to bring facilities back online. But even at restored levels, output rarely matched pre-war efficiency. Refinery capacity remained inconsistent, equipment failures were common, transportation delays accumulated. Then, American submarines began to operate more aggressively. In 1942, U.S. submarine doctrine evolved from caution to relentless interdiction. Tankers, slow and heavily laden, became prime targets. Each sinking represented not just the loss of a ship, but the loss of thousands of barrels of desperately needed fuel. Unlike the United States, which could replace merchant vessels at an astonishing speed, Japan lacked the industrial depth to absorb these losses. The Southern Resource Area, as Japanese planners called it, was vast. Protecting it required patrol aircraft, destroyer escorts, and coordinated convoy systems, all of which consumed more fuel. The empire found itself in a paradox. To secure oil, it had to burn oil. To move oil, it had to risk losing ships that could not be easily replaced. There was another assumption embedded in the original strategy, that United States morale would be too demoralized after Pearl Harbor to mount an immediate, sustained counteroffensive. That assumption proved false. American shipyards accelerated production. Code breakers began penetrating Japanese communications. Carrier aircraft that had escaped destruction at Pearl Harbor were already striking back by early 1942. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, followed by Midway in June, demonstrated that Japan's operational tempo could not be maintained indefinitely. Every major naval engagement required massive fuel expenditures. Carrier task forces consumed thousands of tons of oil simply reaching their launch positions. And when 4 fleet carriers were lost at Midway, Japan did not merely lose ships, it lost trained air crews whose replacements would require additional fuel to train, fuel that was increasingly scarce. Back in Southeast Asia, the occupation grew harsher as frustration mounted. Japanese authorities demanded rapid restoration of oil output. When sabotage or delays were suspected, reprisals followed. Executions and forced labor became tools of enforcement. But coercion could not accelerate refinery reconstruction beyond physical limits. Steel had to be fabricated, machinery had to be aligned, pipelines had to be pressure tested. These were engineering realities, not political obstacles. By late 1942, the strategic picture was becoming clearer. Japan had indeed captured some of the richest oil fields on Earth. But capturing territory was not the same as integrating a functional energy network. Production remained vulnerable, shipping lanes were exposed, tanker losses were mounting, and American industrial output was accelerating beyond anything Japanese planners had projected in 1941. The Southern Resource Area, as Japanese planners called it, was based on a chain of assumptions that oil fields could be taken intact, that repairs would be rapid, that shipping would be secure, and that the war would be decided before long-term logistics became decisive. Each link in that chain proved weaker than expected. The empire had solved one equation, access to raw resources, only to encounter a more complex one, the mathematics of logistics under sustained enemy pressure. Oil in the ground did not power fleets. Oil safely refined, transported, and delivered did. And every mile between Borneo and Tokyo became a corridor of risk. By the end of 1942, the initial illusion of abundance was fading. The reserves were not replenishing at the speed required. Consumption curves remained steep. Tanker numbers were shrinking. The clock that had begun ticking in 1941 had not been reset. It had merely been delayed.
By 1943, the war in the Pacific had transformed into something far less visible than carrier battles and island invasions. It had become a war against shipping. Steel hulls moving slowly across vast stretches of ocean now carried the fate of the Japanese Empire. Inside those hulls was not glory, not headlines, but fuel. The United States had identified the vulnerability early. Japan was an island nation fighting a continental-scale war. Every drop of oil captured in Southeast Asia had to cross thousands of miles of open water to reach refineries and naval depots in the home islands. That journey passed through predictable choke points, the South China Sea, the Luzon Strait, the approaches to Formosa and the Ryukyus. These routes became hunting grounds. American submarines, initially plagued by faulty torpedoes and cautious doctrine, grew increasingly lethal as 1943 progressed. Technical problems with detonators were corrected. Commanders were encouraged to attack aggressively. Intelligence units began to provide more accurate convoy information, and at the center of this transformation was code breaking. U.S. cryptanalysts had penetrated elements of the Japanese naval code system known as JN-25. By reading fragments of operational traffic, they could estimate convoy schedules, routing plans, and tanker movements. The ocean was still vast, but it was no longer opaque. Submarines were no longer searching blindly, they were intercepting. The effect was cumulative and devastating. Tankers, slow and often lightly escorted, were prime targets. When one was sunk, it was not just steel lost to the seabed. It was thousands of barrels of oil, weeks of naval operations, erased in minutes. Unlike the United States, which could replace merchant ships at a staggering pace thanks to mass production, Japan's shipyards lacked capacity and raw materials. Each loss was increasingly permanent. By 1944, American submarines had sunk over half of Japan's merchant fleet. The figure would eventually reach approximately 56%. Oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies fell sharply, not necessarily because production had collapsed, but because delivery had become a lethal gamble. In some months, tankers simply did not arrive. The consequences spread across the Japanese war machine.
Refineries in the home islands began operating below capacity because crude supplies were inconsistent. Naval planners were forced to ration fuel for training exercises. Pilots received fewer flight hours. Carrier air groups, once among the most experienced in the world, began to fill with undertrained replacements. A pilot's skill is measured in hours in the cockpit, and hours required aviation gasoline that no longer flowed freely. The Imperial Japanese Navy faced a brutal paradox. To protect convoys, it needed destroyers and escort vessels at sea. To send those escorts to sea, it needed fuel. To secure more fuel, it had to send additional convoys through submarine-infested waters. The arithmetic was tightening. American industrial output, meanwhile, was accelerating beyond any pre-war projection. New Essex-class aircraft carriers slid down slipways in rapid succession. Oil production in the United States remained secure and abundant. Tankers crossed oceans in escorted convoys. Losses occurred, but replacements outpaced destruction. The United States was fighting a war of attrition with an economy designed for scale. Japan was fighting with a fixed pool of energy that was shrinking. The impact became visible in fleet operations. Major sorties were increasingly rare and carefully calculated. Ships were ordered to conserve fuel by reducing speed. Training cruises were shortened or canceled. Even battleships, symbols of national prestige, were sometimes held in port to preserve precious reserves. The fleet still existed on paper, but its operational freedom was diminishing. By late 1944, the situation approached crisis. Oil stockpiles in Japan had fallen to dangerous levels. Some estimates suggested that remaining reserves were sufficient for only months of sustained naval activity. Aircraft production continued, but aviation fuel shortages limited pilot readiness. The quality gap between American and Japanese aviators widened. In October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the strain became unmistakable. Elements of the Japanese fleet sailed on limited fuel allocations. Aircraft carriers were deployed as decoys, not because they lacked aircraft entirely, but because the trained air crews and fuel required for sustained carrier warfare were no longer available in sufficient numbers. Strategy had shifted from decisive engagement to desperate diversion. The submarine campaign had accomplished what no single surface battle could achieve. It had severed the arteries of the empire. Oil might still exist in the ground at Borneo or Sumatra, but if it could not reach Yokosuka or Kure, it was strategically meaningless. Energy isolated from industry is potential without power. Inside Japan, rationing intensified. Synthetic fuel experiments failed to compensate for losses. Emergency measures were debated, but none could reverse the underlying imbalance. Shipbuilding programs could not keep pace with sinkings. Escort shortages worsened convoy vulnerability. Every attempt to solve one logistical problem exposed another. By early 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy faced a stark reality. It could no longer operate as a maneuvering force. Ships that once ranged confidently across the Pacific were effectively anchored by empty tanks. Some vessels were relocated to areas closer to fuel depots simply to reduce transit consumption. Others remained idle, preserved for a decisive battle that might never come. The war had shifted from dramatic clashes of fleets to the slow suffocation of supply. American submariners rarely saw the broader strategic map. They saw periscopes, torpedo angles, and silhouettes against the horizon. But collectively, their campaign altered the balance of power more decisively than many surface engagements. The empire that had launched the largest carrier strike force in the history in December 1941 was now struggling to move oil from one port to another. The southern resource area still existed. The wells had not all run dry, but the sea lanes had become corridors of destruction. By the time 1945 approached, the arithmetic that began in 1941 evolved into inevitability. Each sunk tanker subtracted weeks of operational capability. Each failed convoy reduced pilot training. Each month tightened the margin for action. The Pacific was no longer just a battlefield. It was a graveyard of fuel.
By 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy still possessed battleships, cruisers, and aircraft carriers. On paper, it remained one of the largest fleets in the world. But fleets do not fight on paper. They fight on fuel, training, and mobility, and all three were slipping away. The first visible crack appeared in the skies over the Philippine Sea in June 1944. The battle that followed would later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American carrier task forces, equipped with new radar systems, better coordination, and highly trained pilots, faced Japanese carrier aircraft that were increasingly flown by inexperienced aviators. The difference was catastrophic. In the early months of the war, Japanese naval pilots were among the best in the world. Years of rigorous training had produced elite air crews capable of long-range precision strikes. But by 1944, that training pipeline had collapsed under fuel shortages and combat losses. Veteran pilots had been killed at Coral Sea, Midway, and throughout the Solomons campaign. Replacements received fewer flight hours, less gunnery practice, and limited carrier landing experience. Aviation gasoline was too precious to expend freely. The result in the Philippine Sea was devastating. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were shot down with minimal American losses. Aircraft carriers that had once projected dominance across the Pacific now launched air groups that could not compete. And behind the tactical defeat was a deeper logistical truth. Japan no longer had the fuel reserves to rebuild quality at scale. Carrier warfare demands constant practice. Pilots must rehearse takeoffs, landings, navigation, formation flying, and combat maneuvers. Each hour in the air burns fuel. When fuel is rationed, proficiency declines. By mid-1944, Japan faced a vicious cycle. Poor training led to higher losses. Higher losses required more training for replacements, but more training required fuel that did not exist. The surface fleet was equally constrained. Battleships and heavy cruisers, designed for decisive engagements, consumed enormous quantities of oil simply moving from port to port. Naval planners began restricting sorties to preserve reserves. Ships were ordered to operate at economical speeds. Exercises were reduced. Some vessels were effectively mothballed while waiting for a final confrontation that commanders hoped would justify expending the remaining fuel. Then came the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, one of the largest naval engagements in history. By this point, Japan's strategic situation was desperate. American forces had landed in the Philippines, threatening to sever the sea lanes between Japan and the oil fields of Southeast Asia entirely. If the Philippines were lost, the remaining flow of crude oil would be cut off. Japanese planners devised an audacious, complex plan. Surface forces would approach from multiple directions, converging on the American invasion fleet. But there was a critical weakness. Fuel allocations were so tight that some ships barely had enough to reach the battle area, let alone return. The carriers assigned to the Northern Force carried limited aircraft and under-trained pilots. They were intended primarily as decoys, bait to lure American carrier groups away from the main engagement. It was a stark admission of reality. The once prized carriers were no longer decisive strike platforms. They were expendable distractions. During the battle, Japanese surface forces came close to inflicting severe damage on American landing forces, but coordination faltered. Communication breakdowns and uncertainty about American strength led to hesitation. Opportunities slipped away.
And even when tactical successes occurred, they could not alter the strategic trajectory. After Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy was a fleet in name more than function. Major capital ships survived, but they were increasingly confined to port. Fuel stockpiles had dropped to levels that made sustained operations impossible. The oil route from Southeast Asia was now largely severed by American control of the Philippines and relentless submarine patrols. At the same time, American industry continued to surge. New carriers entered service faster than Japan could repair old ones. Replacement pilots trained with abundant fuel and standardized programs. The U.S. Navy refined its logistics system into a mobile network of oilers and supply ships capable of sustaining fleets indefinitely at sea. Task forces could refuel mid-ocean and remain on station for months. Japan had no equivalent capability left. Inside naval headquarters, officers confronted grim assessments. Reports detailed shrinking reserves and diminishing readiness. Some advocated conserving fuel for homeland defense. Others argued for one final decisive battle that would expend everything at once. The empire had entered a stage of hollow power. The ships existed, the guns were polished, the flags still flew, but mobility, the essence of naval warfare, was disappearing. A navy that cannot sail freely is a navy already defeated. By late 1944, airfields across Japan struggled with aviation gasoline shortages. Training flights were curtailed further. Kamikaze tactics began to emerge, in part because they required less training time and fewer return flights. When fuel is scarce, missions without return become strategically economical, however tragic. The shift was psychological as well as logistical. Early war confidence rested on speed and surprise. Now strategy revolved around endurance and sacrifice. The operational tempo slowed not because the will to fight vanished, because the tanks were running dry. The Philippines campaign ensured that whatever oil remained in Southeast Asia would have an increasingly difficult journey north. Convoys were intercepted, tankers were sunk, escorts were overwhelmed. Each lost shipment narrowed the window for action. By the beginning of 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy faced a reality unimaginable in 1941. It had ships, but lacked the fuel to deploy them effectively. It had pilots, but not enough gasoline to train them properly. It had ambitions for decisive battle, but insufficient reserves to sustain one. The transformation from dominant strike force to immobilized fleet had taken less than 2 years. It did not occur in a single catastrophic defeat. It unfolded through attrition, rationing, and arithmetic. The empire that once relied on speed now found itself anchored by scarcity. And the final decision, whether to spend the last reserves in one final gesture of defiance, was approaching.
On April 7, 1945, in the gray waters of the East China Sea, the final equation was about to be solved. The battleship Yamato was the largest battleship ever built, 72,000 tons of steel, armed with 9 18.1-inch guns, capable of firing shells weighing more than a small car. She had been constructed as the ultimate symbol of naval supremacy, designed for the decisive surface battle that Japanese doctrine had envisioned for decades. But in the spring of 1945, Yamato was no longer an instrument of strategy. She was an instrument of desperation. American forces had landed on Okinawa on April 1. The island was only a few hundred miles from the Japanese home islands. If Okinawa fell, American bombers and invasion forces would stand at Japan's doorstep. Naval leadership faced a grim reality. There was almost no fuel left for fleet operations. The submarine campaign had devastated shipping. The Philippines had been lost. Oil imports from Southeast Asia had effectively collapsed. Yet an order was issued, Operation 10 Go. The plan was stark.
Yamato, accompanied by a light cruiser and 8 destroyers, would sail south toward Okinawa. She would carry only enough fuel for a one-way journey. Upon arrival, she was to beach herself and serve as a stationary coastal battery, fighting until destroyed. There would be no return. The decision revealed the full extent of the fuel catastrophe. Even assembling this task force required extraordinary measures. At the Tokuyama fuel depot, workers reportedly disobeyed strict allocation orders. They climbed into nearly empty storage tanks and pumped out every remaining drop of oil they could extract. It was an act of quiet defiance, an attempt to give the fleet one last chance to act. But even their effort could not provide enough fuel for a round trip. Yamato sailed, knowing she would not come back. On board were 3,332 officers and sailors. Many understood the mission's nature. Air cover would be minimal. Japan no longer possessed the carrier strength or aviation fuel reserves to protect major surface units far from shore. The voyage itself was a signal intercepted by American intelligence. Code breaking and reconnaissance quickly revealed the sortie. The United States Navy responded with overwhelming force. On April 7th, waves of American carrier aircraft descended upon the Japanese task force. Hundreds of planes, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, fighters, attacked in coordinated strikes. Yamato's anti-aircraft guns fired continuously, filling the sky with flak. But without adequate air cover, the outcome was inevitable. Torpedoes slammed into her port side. Bombs penetrated her decks. Fires spread. Flooding became uncontrollable. As damage mounted, the ship began to list heavily. Attempts to counterflood failed to restore balance. At approximately 2:23 p.m., Yamato capsized. Moments later, her forward magazines detonated in a massive explosion visible for miles, a column of smoke rising thousands of feet into the sky. Of the 3,332 men aboard, only 269 survived. The cruiser Yahagi and 4 destroyers were also sunk. The mission achieved no strategic effect. Okinawa remained firmly in American hands. The Imperial Japanese Navy had expended some of its last usable fuel reserves in a single afternoon. After Operation 10 Go, Japan no longer possessed the capacity to send a major surface combatant to sea. The fleet that had once ranged across the Pacific was effectively immobilized. Ships remained in harbor not because they lacked crews or ammunition, but because they lacked oil. The destruction of Yamato was more than the loss of a battleship. It was the visible end of a strategic illusion that had begun years earlier. In 1941, Japan had calculated that seizing oil fields would secure energy independence. In 1942, it assumed shipping losses could be managed. In 1943 and 44, it hoped decisive engagements might reverse attrition. But by 1945, the numbers had closed in. The empire had gone from roughly 50 million barrels in reserve before Pearl Harbor to scraping the bottom of storage tanks for a one-way mission. Operation 10 Go was not irrational in the emotional sense. It was shaped by a belief in sacrifice, honor, and the possibility of inflicting symbolic resistance. But strategically, it exposed the final consequence of the original miscalculation. Without sustainable fuel logistics, even the most powerful warship ever constructed becomes a stationary target. 4 years ago, Japan had launched the largest carrier strike force in history, projecting power across thousands of miles. Now it could not protect a single battleship within reach of its own shores. The Pacific War did not end on April 7, 1945. Fighting continued. Cities would burn. New weapons would appear. Formal surrender would come months later aboard the USS Missouri. But in operational terms, the Japanese Navy ceased to exist as a maneuvering force the day Yamato sank. The silent war of arithmetic, of production, shipping tonnage, refinery output, and fuel consumption had reached its conclusion. Steel, courage, and firepower had all played their roles, but beneath every decision, beneath every sortie and every battle plan, lay a finite resource measured in barrels. Once that resource was exhausted, strategy narrowed to symbolism. In the end, the most powerful battleship ever built sailed not toward victory, but toward the inevitable result of a miscalculation made years before the first bomb fell. The war had been decided long before Yamato left harbor. It had been decided by the math.